Welcome to Psych 232, Theories of Personality. Today we're doing something a little bit extra, right? Something that's a little extra. We're done talking about the theories of personality. And now we need to look back on some of the theories and evaluate them a little bit from a modern perspective and from a multicultural perspective. So we're going to do a little bit of that. It's not a ton of information, but we're required to do a little bit about this. And remember that this stuff is actually important, and it will be covered on those two quizzes that you have to do by the day of the final. Okay, all that stuff that's left for the class must be done by the day of the final. Okay, by the day the final becomes unavailable. Okay, so it'll become available early. It's already available. Okay, not the final, but those two quizzes. All right, anyway, let's get started. So Freud's theory was the first theory that we talked about. We're not going to talk about all of them, but just to remind you of a few things about Freud's theory in general. Okay, remember that Freud defined personality in terms of the id, ego, and superego. Remember, the id is that part of your personality that functions like an animal. Okay, it is impulsive, it seeks pleasure, right? It wants the biological urges to be satisfied. And then the ego is that part of your personality that thinks, that's logical, that makes decisions, that tries to satisfy the id, and the superego in a way that makes sense. It kind of protects you, okay? And the ego is the most important part of your personality. It should be the strongest part of your personality if you are to be a well-balanced individual and you have a healthy personality. The superego is another part of your personality that has to do with rules and standards you learn from parents, from society, right? You know, thou shalt not kill, right? Wait until you are married to have sex, that kind of stuff. Don't cheat, don't steal, all that stuff, right? What people tell you to do, all that becomes part of your superego. It's like your morality, your moral conscience, okay, or your conscience, okay. So that's a little bit about Freud's theory, just to remind you, okay. There were other things about Freud's theory, but this is just a little bit to remind you of some things, okay. People have criticized Freud's theory because these concepts and their definitions are actually ambiguous. Ambiguous means it's not clear. What the hell is the id, right? It represents, you know, the impulsive, selfish side of you, the animalistic side of you, but does it really exist, or is it just a metaphor, right? Does it exist in the brain? What is Freud really talking about here? Is he just talking about our biology? So it's not clear. Or is he actually talking about that it's something that actually exists in the mind or in the brain? It's not clear, right, what he meant by that. We know what it represents, but is it just a metaphor, or does it actually exist? Same thing with the ego, right? Represents the rational part of your mind. Is he just talking about the brain here, right? Is it just the brain? Because the brain allows us to do those things. Or is he talking about something separate? Okay. The superego, same thing. So the criticism is that we don't know if these things are real or if they're just metaphors, if they just represent things, okay? Or if they're actually things that Freud considered real, right? That your mind really is split into these different parts, okay? That kind of thing. I think I lean more toward the opinion that Freud actually believed that these are different parts of your mind that actually exist. But if you look at the brain, there's a lot more different brain areas and don't necessarily correspond to these things. But Freud believed that the mind actually has three different parts. But the mind has a lot to do with the brain. I don't think Freud would consider it to be the same thing, but that's one of the criticisms. It's ambiguous. It's not really clear whether these things are real or not, or if it's just a metaphor. Another criticism of Freud's theory is that he didn't study emotionally healthy people. He got his ideas from the people he treated, people who were, you know, according to some, mentally ill, people who had emotional problems. And this is where he got a lot of his ideas. If you study healthy people, you would probably reach a different conclusion. Okay, so that's another criticism. He focused also too much on past behavior. That's what critics say, right? He was very concerned about your childhood and what happened during childhood. He wasn't really concerned about the present or the future or anything like that. So it's all about the past, that the past shapes your personality. And critics have really, you know, focused on that and criticized that and basically said that a lot of who we are actually has to do with the present and the future. Okay, and he just focused on the past. He said nothing about multiculturalism. right? Nothing about how his theory would apply, let's say, to people who are not white, or people who are, you know, who are just different. Okay, nothing about that. If you remember, his theory is actually very male biased and has been criticized, especially by those who believe in equality and things like that, and equality of the sexes, right? That Freud's theory is actually very sexist and says a lot of bad things about women. Freud didn't really talk about those things. He didn't talk about multiculturalism. He didn't emphasize basically, you know, this issue about equality between the sexes. It's a very new idea, right? Not very new, but it certainly wasn't a thing during Freud's time. Okay, remember, he lived from like the late 1800s to early 1900s. This whole thing about the women's movement and equality and all that stuff, that didn't really exist back then. Okay, women were basically slaves. Okay, not literally slaves, but maybe you could think of that, but they basically were at the mercy of men and their husbands. So you could kind of think of them like slaves. Okay, and he's been criticized for all those things. What about homosexuality and things like that? Freud might have had some ideas about that, but it's not really clear from his theory how he would explain that. Okay, and we'll talk later on, and we'll talk about multiculturalism, and we'll talk about studies that have looked at people from different cultures and see if these theories still apply. So those are some of the criticisms of Freud's theory. Okay. Karen Horney's theory. Remember Karen Horney's theory? She talked about she talked more about social relationships as being more important than those biological urges that Freud talked about. Right? She really countered Freud's point of view and really disagreed with him about the whole thing about penis envy. She didn't believe, as Freud said, that women have penis envy. Right, and she really thought that Freud's theory basically didn't say very good things about women. So Karen Horney's theory provides an example of a female's point of view and personality, and it's the only one that we covered. Okay, she is the you know, the only female to have a very well-known theory of personality. There are others, you know, who have proposed things, and there's plenty of female researchers now and scientists, things like that. But Karen Horney is the best known, and she accomplished this, by the way, at a time when women were not even encouraged to go to school or work, or let alone have any thoughts of their own. Okay, but Karen Horney was a fighter, right? She wanted to have an education. She believed she was smart, and she proposed her own theory, and it's very well known, and it provides an example of a woman's point of view. It stands in contrast to Freud's theory, very different from Freud's theory, and is actually very popular nowadays. It's seen renewed interest because it emphasized equal opportunities for females. Karen Horney was talking about this stuff, right? About the oppression of women and how men belittle women and things like that, even before there was any movement about this. So she's very popular nowadays with feminists, with the whole movement of equality, that women deserve equality, equal pay, and deserve not to be sexually harassed or questioned so much about what they wear and things like that. We still live in a very sexist society, okay? And Karen Horney is very popular nowadays because she was talking about similar things, you know, a long time ago. So she's seen as a champion of women's rights at a time when the movement didn't even exist. Maslow's theory, remember Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Maslow proposed a theory that basically says that we have 5 innate needs, 5 needs, and it's best to satisfy them in a certain order, right? Remember the needs were the physiological needs, safety needs, belonging needs, esteem needs, and self-actualization. Those were the 5 needs. The physiological and safety needs, remember, needs to be satisfied, are satisfied by parents in the first 2 years of life, according to Maslow, right? Remember that, right? Parents, they feed you, they keep you safe, that kind of stuff. Emotional and belonging needs follow after that. Self-esteem and self-actualization needs are last. That's the order of the hierarchy of needs. His theory has been criticized because, you know, the needs don't have to be satisfied in that order. People have questioned, you know, the order of these needs. And people have said, you know what, you can satisfy your esteem needs before your belonging needs. You can decide to put off school, right? I mean, no, to put off school. You can decide to put off, friends and relationships and things like that to go to school and achieve something and develop those, and instead work on those esteem needs. And there are people who said that they have self-actualized, despite the fact that, that they're poor and that they really don't have much in the way to show up for their esteem needs, but they believe they follow a different way of life, right? That's not materialistic. So he has been criticized for things like that. And his theory has also been criticized for being based on biographies of famous, successful individuals. So Maslow got a lot of his ideas from studying famous people like Gandhi and Martin Luther King and Abraham Lincoln and things like that. People who changed society, people who basically lived their lives according to many to their full potential. That's where he got a lot of his ideas about self-actualization. And people have said, well, this is not scientifically rigorous. Most people are not like these people. These people are extraordinary. They're, they're different. Most of us are not going to be famous. Most of us are not going to change the world. We're not going to be like these people. So is it really fair to develop ideas about what self-actualization is based on those people? So it's been criticized for those things. Here's the thing. No theory, no point of view is perfect. No point of view or theory has a monopoly on the truth. Each theory, I think, has a little piece of the truth. Okay, but there is no perfect, science, so to speak. Okay, science only finds evidence. Theories try to explain that evidence. There is no such thing in perfection. There's no such thing as perfection when it comes to science. We only find evidence. And you can criticize any theory. They all have flaws. Rogers' theory, remember Rogers' theory? He talked about unconditional positive regard being central to his theory, right? That people need unconditional positive regard, right? Complete unconditional acceptance. And if you get that, you will develop positive self-regard, and then you're more likely to accept and love other people as well. So unconditional positive regard is provided by parents, right? It's critical to personality development. And it led to the development of person-centered therapy. His theory, Rogers' theory, led to the development of person-centered therapy, which is a type of therapy that's still in use today that's very helpful, okay? The therapist provides unconditional positive regard for the client so that they develop positive self-regard for themselves. And when they regard themselves positively, they're more likely to function better and more likely to accept other people and get along with other people. That's what's been said about Rogers' theory. So not too much criticism there, okay? Skinner's theory, remember Skinner's theory, right? Skinner is all about reinforcement and punishment, right? Everything is learned, right? Our personalities are learned. So Skinner's theory explains behavior in terms of rewards and punishment and operant conditioning. Remember, right? We learn through class conditioning, through operant conditioning, through rewards and punishments. That's how we learn our behavior. And our personality is nothing more than a pattern of behavior, according to Skinner. The theory has been criticized because it's regarded as being too deterministic. There is no free will from Skinner's point of view. We are controlled by the consequences. We are controlled by our rewards, right? By punishment. We have no free will of our own. If you think about Skinner's theory, we can be made to do anything, think anything, if we are given the right rewards or given certain punishments. So it leaves no room for free will. And people rightly say that, we do have free will. We can choose what to do with ourselves and what to think. And Skinner's theory doesn't leave in any room for that. The theory also ignores conscious and unconscious forces. So with conscious things, the theory ignores thinking. It doesn't really consider thinking to be very important. It doesn't matter what you think. What matters is your behavior from Skinner's point of view. Your thinking doesn't matter. Okay? So from Skinner's point of view, if you hurt someone, it wouldn't matter if it was intentional or unintentional. For most of us, it makes a big difference, right? If something is accidental, that means we didn't mean any harm, right? It's different than if we did it on purpose. Such thinking doesn't matter for Skinner's point of view, right? From the point of view of his theory. The behavior is the behavior, okay? He also ignored unconscious factors. There has been research into the unconscious, right? And that there is processing of information at lower levels of awareness, kind of supporting Freud's theory a little bit. Skinner says nothing about any kind of thinking at any level, whether it's conscious or unconscious. And there clearly is such a thing from, if we look at more modern research. He also did experiments on animals like pigeons and rats, and that's where he tested his ideas. That's how he tested his ideas. And he believes that we're the same way. We're like these animals. But people have said it's difficult to extrapolate these experiments on animals to humans, right? That we don't necessarily function the same way. We're not necessarily the same way. We are similar, but we're not exactly like animals. And his theory has been criticized for that. And basically, we have no free will. Okay, that's a big problem with Skinner's theory. Let's keep going. Bandura's theory. Remember, we just talked about Bandura's theory. It explains behavior in terms of vicarious reinforcement and punishment, right? Bandura's theory is all about observational learning. We learn from basically observing others. Okay, we learn through observation. And we don't have to experience rewards or punishment ourselves in order for us to learn something. We can watch somebody else being rewarded or punished. The theory has received a lot of empirical support, right? A lot of research supports his theory, okay, and what he said. It's also successful as a form of therapy, right? There is therapy, a lot of therapies actually, different kinds based on Bandura's theory. However, the theory ignores underlying causes of behavior. The theory doesn't talk about what causes behavior. Okay, what the causes are, right? It just talks about basically that we basically learn behavior by watching others. It doesn't talk about biology, which is clearly something that is a factor, or maybe even the unconscious, which might be a factor as well, because we do process information at different levels of awareness. Okay, so the theory ignores all those things, but it does say a lot of things that are credible and has been very successful as a therapy. Let's keep going. Evaluating Bandura's theory. Okay, here's the thing. This is not so much just about Bandura's theory. Okay, that heading at the top there isn't really accurate, but there are personality questionnaires that have been used to evaluate some of these theories. It's not just about Bandura's theory. Personality questionnaires started being used first during World War I to screen for what they call shell shock. Okay, here's the thing: they recruited a bunch of people, right, to serve in the war and things like that, and they wanted to screen out basically people who would be more susceptible to shell shock, more people who would be more susceptible to post-traumatic stress disorder. Things like that, right? Actually, not to screen before they got drafted, but afterward, when people were coming back, they were traumatized, they were psychologically basically messed up, so to speak, and they called it shell shock. You know, people have gone to war. Some of them had been injured, some of them were nearly killed, and they survived, and now they were traumatized, and they had a lot of psychological issues, and that's what they called it back then. They called it shell shock. So they basically, developed questionnaires to determine if these people coming back from war were basically suffering from this. That's kind of how they started using personality questionnaires. Later, these questionnaires started being used by corporations to weed out union sympathizers. Think about that, right? Unions are, organizations that fight for people's working conditions, for their pay, right? If you belong to a union, you probably have better pay and better benefits, better working conditions than if you didn't have a union. But of course, these things are costly to businesses. And they started using these questionnaires, these personality questionnaires, to weed out people who would be more likely to join a union. They didn't want to hire those people. So there's been basically, since the 70s, or maybe even before that, politicians and businessmen, all kinds of people have been fighting unions and trying to get rid of them so that businesses could be more profitable and more successful, right? But remember, unions fight for higher wages, for better working conditions, better benefits, things like that. It's actually a good thing for workers to have that. So they started using it for that, which is a very sinister use of personality questionnaires, right? To try to figure out who are the people who are more likely to join unions, and well, let's not hire those people. By the way, I want to point out that corporations still use personality questionnaires today. Not necessarily to weed out people who might join a union, but to figure out if you're a good fit for the corporation, if you have the right personality for this kind of job or for this corporation. They still do that today, but not to weed out union sympathizers. But yes, personality questionnaires are used more and more now. They're used for education, they're used for employment, for organization, for all sorts of things. And here are some examples of some of these personality questionnaires. There's the MMPI, which stands for the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. There's Catel's 16-factor, I forget what PFQ stands for, but a personality questionnaire based on Catel's theory, which has 16 factors. There's the Myers-Briggs Personality Inventory, which is based on Jung's theory. And there's a whole bunch of other ones that are used for employment nowadays. 35% of human resource professionals around the world use personality questionnaires for hiring. They want you to take a certain personality questionnaire and they want to determine if you would be a good fit for the job. About a third of the times they use this. Okay, so they're very commonly used today. And the use of these personality questionnaires is growing because we could find out what people are like and whether they'd be a good match for the corporation. Now, let's talk about multiculturalism, multicultural consideration. What happens if we think about these theories from a multicultural point of view? Do they still apply? Do they still work? So cultures can vary very strongly. Cultures can be vastly different as far as, you know, what they emphasize, what they care about, what the beliefs are, right? So do these theories still apply? Now, there is one very important way to determine how cultures vary is to look at the issue of individualism versus collectivism. Some cultures are more individualistic, so others are more collectivist. Individualism or individualistic cultures emphasize personal freedom, choice, action, right? That kind of stuff. The US, Europe, Canada, Australia, those are some examples of cultures that are more individualistic. The US is the #1 individualistic country in the world. In other words, we are the most individualistic. Individualism means that it's all about choice, freedom, responsibility, that kind of stuff, right? If you want to succeed, it's up to you to work hard. That's what we believe here. It's up to you to do well in school, work hard, right? If you commit a crime, it's up to you, right? To get, well, not up to you. If you commit a crime, you're the one who gets punished, okay? And we placed a lot of emphasis of individual rights and freedoms and things like that, but also individual punishment, right? You have the right to say what you want, to listen to whatever music you want, to worship how you want. You can even worship, you can even be a Satanist if you want, or you can be, you know, a, what do they call it? When you don't believe in God, I forget what the word is. For some reason, I'm forgetting the word. An atheist. You can be an atheist if you want, and it's all allowed here in the U.S., right? You can befriend whoever you want. You can live where you want as long as you can afford it, right? We have individualism here. Europe, Canada, Australia, basically everywhere there's a bunch of white people, it's more individualistic, okay, if you think about it that way. Now, we are more multicultural today. We do still have Latinos, Asians, and Black people and things like that, but those cultures are a little bit more collectivist, okay? Collectivism, they emphasize more group norms, values, role expectations. So Latinos, Asians, other people basically are more kind of collectivist. We care more about what the group thinks. Okay, some very strong individualistic cultures here would be Latin America, India, China. Black people are a little bit more collectivist than white people as well, but these are very strong, more strongly collectivist. China, I would probably consider to be the most strongly collectivist. Okay, for these cultures, your individual rights and freedoms are not as important. What's more important is what the group thinks. Like for Latinos, let me explain. In Latin America, families have a lot of influence over their children, over what their children think and how they behave and things like that. They usually want to determine basically who your friends can be, who you can marry, stuff like that. Now, they can't really control you. We do have freedoms, right, and rights, but family has quite a large influence, and that's a lot of Latin families are very tight knit. You know, they really value those relationships, and often they want to stay close to their families. And it's a common thing also in India and China and even the Middle East, right? More family oriented, care more about the group. Now, let me explain China in a moment. China is very, very collectivist. For China, it's not so much about individualism, your individual rights, freedoms. It's more about like, this is what you should do according to Chinese society, according to the government, right? They're more collectivist, okay? Families have a lot more control over their children in China, and even Chinese people here, those who are Chinese American, they're more collectivist. But let me tell you about China, because it's a little bit more extreme over there. In China, they don't have what you call an internet, where you can just go to whatever site you want and look at whatever you want, like we do here in the US, right? That's part of our freedom here, right? Our individualism, right? We have the internet and we can go wherever you want, look at wherever we want, right? Doesn't matter how awful it is, whatever we're looking at, or whether it's something that has to do with superstition or conspiracy theories or stuff that's more credible, like scientific stuff. It doesn't matter. In China, that is not the way it is. China has what you call an intranet. An intranet means that they can go in China. They do have the internet, and you can go to certain sites, but only sites that the government approves of. They don't have Facebook. They don't have Twitter, Google, YouTube, Instagram, Wikipedia. They don't have any of that stuff, but they have their own versions of it that are basically approved of by the government. They don't allow all this free speech and all this stuff. You can't say whatever you want in China or post whatever you want. You can get into a lot of trouble if you post stuff there that's anti-government, okay? It's a very different society. It's more about the people as a whole, and the government controls the people as a whole, than it is about individualism, okay? That's an example. I'm trying to think of there's other things that I'm sure I'm leaving out. Yeah, so it's more collectivist. Let me tell you a little bit about India. In a lot of places in India, they still have arranged marriages. So it's not about you and what you want, it's about what your family wants. And they decide who you marry in a lot of places. That's more collectivist. It comes in different forms, some more extreme than others, but collectivism means that we're usually more family oriented, we're more about the group, less about individual rights and freedoms. Now, I know that a lot of you here, right, living here in the US, do believe in individualism, right, individual rights and freedoms and stuff, because you're in the US, you're Americans, right, you believe in that stuff, as I do myself, right? But we have some of these traditions that still kind of influence us, even though we still believe in individualism. This explains a lot about the differences between cultures, right? Is it more individualistic or more collectivist? That will affect personality, okay? Because if we look at individualism and collectivism, what we'll find is that those from individualistic cultures are more extroverted. In other words, they're more social, more outgoing. They tend to be more happy. They have higher self-esteem, and they're more optimistic about the future. That's what the research shows, right? Why is that? Because individualistic cultures emphasize self-enhancement. It's about me, me, me. Look at me. I'm awesome. I did this. I did that, right? That's individualism. I can do this. I can do that, right? It's individualism. You get the attention. You get the credit. That's what the research says. We're more extroverted, more happy, more higher self-esteem. Now, I do come from Latin America. I do come from that culture that's more collectivist. But living here in the US, we have acculturated, and a lot of us do believe in individualism, individual rights and freedoms and things like that, okay? Now, collectivist cultures, right? When you study collectivist cultures, research has shown that they are less extroverted. They're not as outgoing. They're more shy, okay? Not as outgoing, not as fun-loving, less happy. They have lower self-esteem, and they're less optimistic about the future. Why? Because those cultures emphasize more self-effacement. That means describing oneself in more negative terms. Here's the thing, let me explain that. For collectivist cultures, it's not about you. You don't get the credit when you succeed, right? It's not about you. It's about others. It's about the family. It's about the group. It's about the society. It's about all of China if you're Chinese, right? And the Chinese people. So collectivist cultures, you know, it turns out when you study them personality-wise, it seems kind of negative. But it's because if you're, you know, Latino, if you're Asian, that kind of stuff, and you succeed, you're supposed to give other people credit. You've known this if you've had to give a speech in front of your family. If you're Latino or Chinese or something like that, right? Let's say you graduate from college, you're finally getting your degree, and you have a celebration to celebrate. And I know this is a Latino. I've had to do this. My other brothers have had to do this, right? We have to go up there. We have this celebration, and we give a speech, and we have other people talk about us, and we give a speech, and we say things like, it is not because of me that I'm up here. It is because of you guys, because of the love you guys showed me, and because of my family who supported me, right? Who loved me. You guys are the reason why I've achieved this. So in other words, you have to give credit to others. You don't matter as much. You don't get the credit. You're not supposed to give yourself all the credit. So you have to feel worse about yourself, so to speak. And that's what the research shows, that you're not as happy, right? You're not allowed to claim that much credit. If you do claim credit, by the way, as a Latino or as an Asian American, you go up there and you say, yeah, I'm smart, I'm awesome, it's because of me, people are gonna hate you. That's what happens to you as a Latino. I've seen it. People will key your car, show up there with your nice fancy car. Oh, look at Mr. Big Shot, right? Key your car, right? Because you give too much credit to yourself instead of giving credit to others. We are more collectivist, right? We're supposed to give credit to other people. It's not about me. It's about we. We have done this, not me, that kind of stuff, right? It's a very different way of looking at things. And it means usually that, you know, you can't be as happy, right? You don't get all the credit. But to some extent, that research is a bit biased, okay? And I'll explain why in a moment. There's MMPI research on Blacks, Asians, Latinos, right? The MMPI is a really long personality questionnaire that has hundreds of questions, okay? And they have given that test to a lot of different people, and they've compared Asian people and Black people and Latinos and white people, right? And by the way, most of the research that we hear about when it comes to these personality questionnaires, or whenever we learn anything, what we're usually learning about is just white people, by the way. That's just the way it is, okay? But there is research on Asian people, Black people, on people from other cultures, right? Other ethnicities, to see, okay, well, let's look at these people. What is it like for them? Okay, so when it comes to research done with the MMPI, research on Asians, the research shows that Asians have higher rates of depression. For those that are from Hong Kong, those are basically Asian people. There are a lot of, Hong Kong Chinese students. Remember, Hong Kong is basically a part of China. It was leased by the British for like 100 years, but it's always been part of China. And now the lease has expired, and China wants to take control now of Hong Kong, and the people there are more used to freedom and things like that, and they're having some trouble. But Hong Kong is part of China, and it is there's a lot of Chinese people there. Research has shown that even the Chinese people in Hong Kong that are used to more freedoms than people who live in mainland China have higher rates of depression compared to American college students. Why? Again, you have to think about, right? As Chinese, right? It's more about self-effacement. You are not that good. You give credit to your family, to others. You say that you are not that smart, that you were lucky. That's because of your family. It's because of others who have helped you, right? So you don't give yourself the credit. Different cultural views, right? So you don't get the credit. And research shows that they have higher rates of depression. Asian people have higher rates of depression. Now I want to question this, right? Do they really have higher rates of depression, or does it just look that way on the personality questionnaires because of their culture, because they're not supposed to give credit to themselves so much and not supposed to say that they're awesome? There is the possibility that maybe they're not more depressed than Americans, but they're just supposed to downplay how good they are or how they feel about themselves. Not so positive, right? I will tell you that there's other research that says that when it comes to Asian Americans, even though a lot of them do very well in math, that's the stereotype, and they do better on math on average than even white Americans, they believe they're actually not that good at math. Why would they say that? Why would they believe that? Because they're not supposed to give credit to themselves, even though they're doing a lot better than Americans on average. Different culture, right? And the research, the personality research, when it looks at these different cultures, finds some interesting differences, that these people are more, more likely to be depressed. But then again, we have to question, right? Is that our own biased point of view? Is that just a biased point of view? Because remember, these personality questionnaires were developed by white people for white people. And when you study other people with these personality questionnaires, those people seem different. Is it just because of the questionnaire and the fact that it's biased, or is that really happening? We have to think about that. Research from the MMPI has shown that that Black people are more suspicious, more lacking in trust, right? And more on guard relative to whites. That white people are basically more trusting, less suspicious, and Black people are just suspicious, less trusting, and stuff like that. Why would that be? It's obvious why, right? Because of the history of racism and prejudice, right? All that stuff, right? What others have done to them, what white people have done to them for the most part. Yeah, when white people study Black people, they seem suspicious, not very trusting, right? But that doesn't mean that's the way they are. I will tell you, I know about research done by Black people on Black people, and it shows that Black people are extroverted and happy and fun-loving, right? And that's the way Black people are according to the research, right? But research done by white people says very negative things about Black people. But then again, you have to think, right? Who's doing the research and how do people feel around those people, right? And being reminded of the history of racism and prejudice when you're around those people, right? It's a very different reality for Black people. Latinos, there's nothing that interesting to say about Latinos. Their scores seem to be similar to that of whites, as far as how extroverted they are, how open they are, and stuff like that. Okay, so but yeah, very different things when it comes to Asian people and Black people, what the personality research says about them. There's also research that compares men and women, and guess what? It doesn't say very nice things about women. When it comes to assertiveness, women score lower on this compared to men. The research shows that women are a lot less assertive than men, that women stand up for themselves less, right? That they believe in themselves less, that kind of stuff. Why, right? Sex role training, right? Because of these sex roles, because men and women are raised to believe different things. Women are raised to be more relationship oriented, not aggressive, not competitive, right? Not too assertive, right? That's the way traditionally women are raised. And as a matter of fact, women that are very competitive and assertive, we don't like those women. I'm not saying me personally, but society doesn't like those women. Think about Hillary Clinton. She ran for president. Very competent woman, very smart woman. But our society doesn't like women like that. And a lot of people hated her for it. A lot of people still do. And they didn't give her a chance. And she lost the election, probably because she's a woman. If she would have been a man, she would have won easily. But we don't like women who are like that. We call them bossy. We call them the B word, bitch, right? That's what we think of women who are strong and who are assertive and who are aggressive and who want to succeed and take over positions that are normally basically taken by men. Just look at all the history of all our presidents. They're all males. You think that's by accident? It is not. It's sexism. Someday in the future, we'll have a woman president. I don't know when it's going to be. We've already had a Black president, but we haven't had a woman president. And I'm not very optimistic about that it's going to be anytime soon, because we live in a very biased society, very sexist society, and biased in many ways. Okay, but that's it, guys. That is the last slide. So I will stop here, stop recording.